You might imagine medieval queens as women swathed in velvet gowns, sitting serenely beside their husbands, or walking in candlelit halls with tapestries draped across the walls. Yet behind the image of majesty, their greatest duty was not always ruling, advising, or even being seen in public. For most queens of the medieval era, the single responsibility that overshadowed every other expectation was to bear children, preferably sons. Without heirs, dynasties faltered, alliances crumbled, and kingdoms faced the looming shadow of instability. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, embodies the weight of this duty. Born into the Castilian royal house in 1241, Eleanor was a child of dynastic politics from the beginning. Her marriage to Edward was not a romantic decision, but a careful arrangement that bound the kingdoms of Castile and England closer together in a web of diplomacy. At the age of 13, she left her homeland behind to stand beside her husband in a foreign court, carrying with her not only jewels and fine gowns but also the unspoken burden: she was expected to secure the English crown with children. For Eleanor, the act of childbearing became almost continuous. Between the years of 1255 and 1284, she bore at least 16 children, though only a handful lived to adulthood. It is easy to overlook what this meant in real terms. Pregnancy after pregnancy, year after year, she subjected her body to the relentless cycle of conception, childbirth, recovery, or grief, when infants did not survive. In her world, infertility was not simply a private sorrow, it was a public failure, for every noble in England kept count of royal births. The pressure upon Eleanor was hardly unique. Medieval queens lived under a silent but absolute rule: a queen who could not produce heirs was vulnerable. Some were set aside, others endured humiliation, and some were even blamed for political unrest. A queen's womb was considered an extension of the realm itself. A fertile queen meant stability, continuity, and the promise of future leadership. An infertile queen represented weakness, danger, even divine disfavor. In Eleanor's time, medicine understood little about fertility. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant mortality were common, yet the blame almost always fell upon the queen. Male infertility was rarely considered, for men were seen as the givers of life, while women were the vessels. If a royal marriage did not produce children, whispers began, sometimes gently, sometimes cruelly, that the queen was cursed, sinful, or simply incapable. Imagine the courtly life of Eleanor. Banquets filled the great halls, tournaments displayed knightly valor, and diplomatic missions occupied her husband's attention. Yet within this spectacle, her body was the subject of constant scrutiny. Servants, courtiers, even foreign ambassadors speculated on her condition. Was she with child? Had she miscarried? Was she fertile enough to carry the line of Plantagenets forward? For Eleanor, as for many queens, privacy was non-existent. Every pregnancy was a public matter, and every loss echoed through the realm. This expectation was not confined to England. Across Europe, queens faced similar trials. In France, Germany, Aragon, and Hungary, the fate of dynasties rested in royal nurseries. Marriages were treaties, and children were the living signatures that secured them. A son could anchor peace between warring houses. A daughter could be promised as a bride to seal a future alliance. The absence of such children meant fragile promises and uneasy truces. Eleanor's story takes us into the quiet but heavy burden of queenship. It is tempting to think of queens as symbols, but Eleanor's daily life was one of exhaustion, recovery, and grief. Historical records tell us that she traveled extensively with Edward, even during pregnancies, and endured the dangers of childbirth far from familiar comforts. At least 6 of her children died in infancy or early childhood, and each loss was not merely a personal tragedy but a political setback. Childbirth itself was perilous. In the medieval era, women gave birth without the benefit of modern medicine. Midwives relied on herbs, prayers, and rituals. Infection was common, hemorrhage a constant risk. Even for a queen surrounded by attendants, childbirth could become a death sentence. Eleanor narrowly survived multiple births, but many queens did not. For example, Isabella of France, another queen consort of England, faced constant anxiety about her fertility, and queens like Jane Seymour in the Tudor period later lost their lives to childbirth. The cultural and religious framework of the time only deepened the burden. The Church often presented fertility as divine blessing and infertility as punishment or curse. A queen who bore sons was praised as virtuous and godly. One who could not was viewed with suspicion. Did she harbor secret sins? Was she the victim of sorcery? Even natural misfortune could be interpreted as supernatural judgment. For Eleanor and her peers, this meant that every cradle left empty carried not only sorrow but stigma. Yet Eleanor fulfilled her role in ways that gave her unusual security. She bore Edward many children, including the long-awaited heir, the future Edward II. Even so, the heavy cost of her duty can be traced in her health. By her final pregnancy in 1284, Eleanor was weakened. She died in 1290 at the age of 49, not long after giving birth to her last child. Her death was deeply mourned by Edward, who famously erected 12 stone crosses, known as the Eleanor Crosses, at each stop where her funeral procession rested. The crosses endure as monuments to her memory, but they also serve as a reminder of the bodily price she paid for her role. What becomes clear through Eleanor's life is that queenship in the medieval world was inseparable from childbearing. Her legacy was shaped as much by her children, living and dead, as by her political actions or personal virtues. The story of Eleanor of Castile illustrates the larger truth that for medieval queens, motherhood was more than personal, it was political destiny. But this raises a deeper question: what happened to queens who could not fulfill this duty at all? If Eleanor secured her place by producing heirs, what of those who failed, those who were barren, or whose children never survived infancy? How did the courts and kingdoms treat such women, and what became of their lives when they could not give the realm an heir? When you think back to Eleanor of Castile, you recall a queen who fulfilled her role, even at great personal cost. She left behind a legacy of children, monuments, and memories. But Eleanor's story is not the full picture. To understand the unspoken fragility of medieval queenship, you must look at those women who could not bear heirs at all, or whose children never survived to adulthood. Their fates reveal the harsher side of royal marriage, where a queen's body was often weighed like a treaty, useful when fruitful, disposable when barren. One of the starkest examples comes from England in the early 13th century. King John, infamous for his disputes with the nobility and the Magna Carta, married Isabella of Angoulême. Their marriage began in scandal, since John had set aside another bride to take Isabella, who was still a child. Isabella gave him children, but the early years of their union raised doubts about fertility. Before the births began, courtiers whispered anxiously. If she failed, what would happen to the realm? What would John do? For queens, time was always ticking, but for other queens, there was no reprieve. Consider the plight of Margaret of France, the second wife of Edward I. After Eleanor of Castile's death, Edward married Margaret in 1299. She was much younger than him and bore him 2 sons, though neither survived infancy. Her situation was precarious. As a widow remarried into a foreign court, she was valuable only so long as she produced heirs. When her children died, she receded quietly into the background of English politics, remembered more for her foreign birth than for her impact. This pattern was repeated across Europe. In France, Queen Joan of Burgundy, the consort of Philip VI, was scrutinized for her lack of living sons. In Hungary, Queen Elizabeth of Bosnia found her legitimacy undermined when her daughters could not secure the dynasty's continuation. In Aragon, childless queens were often pushed aside in favor of second marriages, where kings sought more fertile wives. The tragedy is that many of these women were not necessarily infertile. The high rate of child mortality meant that queens could bear multiple children, only to bury them all before they reached maturity. In such cases, the public eye rarely distinguished between infertility and repeated loss. The outcome was the same: no heir. And in a world where succession was everything, failure meant danger. The responses to childlessness varied. Sometimes, queens were formally annulled. Kings could appeal to the Pope, citing consanguinity, pre-contracts, or technicalities to dissolve a marriage that had not produced heirs. Behind the legal language, the real motive was clear: the queen had not borne children. Other times, queens were quietly marginalized. They retained their titles but lost influence at court. Their chambers became smaller, their households reduced. They were pushed to the periphery of political life, while the king's attention shifted to mistresses or plans for remarriage. One of the most famous cases of annulment due to childlessness is that of Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century. Though Eleanor of Aquitaine later became one of the most powerful queens in Europe, her marriage to Louis was dissolved after 15 years on the grounds of consanguinity. But behind the official explanation was a simple truth: Eleanor had only given Louis 2 daughters, no sons. The French crown needed a male heir, and Eleanor was blamed. Shortly after, Louis remarried and fathered sons. Eleanor went on to wed Henry II of England and produced 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and John. Her case reminds you of how blame was placed on queens, even when kings themselves were fertile only with certain partners. Imagine, for a moment, what it was like to be such a queen. You lived surrounded by opulence, yet your worth was reduced to the size of a cradle. Each month that passed without a pregnancy was a silent judgment. Each birth that ended in stillness rather than a cry was a strike against you. Courtiers whispered, ambassadors reported home, and rival claimants to the throne grew bolder. Your marriage, sealed in ceremony, blessed by priests, bound by vows, could be unbound if your womb remained empty. Religion compounded the pressure. Clergy often framed childlessness as divine punishment. Some priests preached that barren queens were paying for hidden sins. Others suggested that God withheld heirs to test a couple's virtue. Remedies ranged from pilgrimages to relics, to elaborate prayers, to charms meant to open the womb. Kings and queens sometimes traveled to shrines, seeking miracles. Yet when these failed, suspicion often turned to the queen. And what of the personal toll? Beyond politics, these women bore private grief. A queen without children often lived surrounded by others' offspring, stepchildren, nieces, nephews, the heirs of courtiers. She would have watched the royal nursery fill with children of concubines, or seen her husband's illegitimate sons and daughters thrive while her own chambers were quiet. Some queens turned inward, retreating into religious devotion. Others maintained dignity, continuing their ceremonial roles while living under constant scrutiny. It is striking to note how their names faded from memory. Eleanor of Castile is remembered because she succeeded. Eleanor of Aquitaine is remembered because she remarried and later produced heirs. But Margaret of France, Isabella of Bavaria, Joan of Burgundy, so many names exist only in genealogies, without stories. Their lives were lived under shadow, their significance measured in what they could not provide. This silence itself tells you something important, that history, like the courts of medieval Europe, often passed over women who did not bear children. They left no heirs to continue their lines, no dynasties to carry their memory. They were written out as quietly as they were marginalized in life. And yet, scattered through the records, you find traces, letters pleading for papal support, chroniclers noting dismissals, accounts of court ceremonies where queens stood beside kings in silence. These fragments remind you that even childless queens carried the weight of crowns. They were not only wives but mediators of alliances, keepers of culture, and symbols of continuity, even when their bodies did not fulfill what was demanded. The deeper question, however, still lingers: what did survival look like for these women? Once pushed aside, where did they go? Did they remain at court, in quiet marginality, or retreat into convents and widowhood? Were they permitted dignity, or were they erased entirely? When a medieval queen could not provide heirs, her life often shifted from the center of political drama to the margins of quiet endurance. But what did survival look like for these women once their usefulness as dynastic mothers had been questioned, or even discarded? To answer this, you must step carefully into the subdued but revealing spaces of convents, dowager courts, and patronage records, where forgotten queens still left faint traces of their lives. Consider the fate of queens who found themselves effectively retired from royal duty. One pathway was widowhood. A queen without children who outlived her husband often faced limited choices. She could remain at court as dowager queen, but her influence was tied to whether the new monarch allowed her dignity. In some cases, she was pushed aside, her properties seized or reassigned, her household diminished. But in others, she carved out a second life. Convents became havens for many such women. In medieval Europe, entering a convent was not necessarily a retreat into obscurity. Wealthy or high-born women could become abbesses, wielding considerable local power. They controlled land, oversaw economic activity, and commanded respect within religious communities. A childless queen in a convent might find herself freer than she had been at court, relieved of the pressure of fertility, able to devote herself to devotion, scholarship, or patronage of the arts. Some even turned convents into cultural centers, sponsoring manuscripts, liturgy, and architecture. One striking example is Blanche of Navarre, Queen of France in the 14th century. Married to Philip VI, she bore only one daughter, who died young. After her husband's death, Blanche withdrew from court life. She lived quietly, devoutly, supporting monasteries and churches. Though her political role ended abruptly, her religious patronage ensured that her name survived in liturgical calendars and monastic charters. Her womb did not secure dynasties, but her faith left spiritual legacies. Other childless queens clung to influence through patronage of the arts, scholarship, or diplomacy. Even when marginalized, they could act as cultural brokers. Without the constant cycle of pregnancies, some queens devoted time to reading, correspondence, and the commissioning of works that enriched their courts. Margaret of Austria, though not a queen but a regent, is a reminder of how childless royal women could shape politics indirectly. She lost her children young but became one of the most effective rulers of her time, arranging marriages and treaties that altered the map of Europe. It is tempting to see childless queens purely as tragic figures, but their lives often show resilience. Many turned their lack of children into an opportunity to build alternative forms of legacy. Some left architectural projects, churches, hospitals, or schools. Others preserved dynastic memory by commissioning chronicles or genealogies. Their influence was quieter, less obvious than heirs in a nursery, but it persisted in ways that softened the sharpness of their political failures. Still, the personal grief cannot be overlooked. Chroniclers occasionally record queens who wept openly at the death of children, or who confessed fears about barrenness. Some sought pilgrimages to holy sites. The shrine of Saint Anne, Mary's mother and the patron saint of childbearing, became a favored destination. Others journeyed to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Rome, desperate for blessings. Imagine the processions, a queen in her finest robes, kneeling at relics, surrounded by priests chanting prayers, while her ladies-in-waiting whispered about whether the pilgrimage would succeed. Each journey was both act of faith and last hope against whispers at court. At times, queens resisted their erasure. Letters survive in which they appealed to the Pope, to family back home, or to allies abroad, seeking protection of property or dignity. Some childless queens used their natal families as shields, retreating to their homelands where brothers or nephews ensured them safe living. Isabella of Hainaut, who married Philip II of France, died young, but had she survived childless, her powerful Hainaut kin might have provided a similar refuge. And yet, many faded into silence. Chroniclers recorded their marriages, sometimes their coronations, and then nothing. No heirs meant no dynastic memory to carry their names forward. They were buried in monasteries, their tombs plain compared to kings. In this way, history itself mirrored their erasure, rewarding queens who bore heirs with remembrance, forgetting those who did not. Still, if you look carefully, you find their influence in subtler ways. A dowry preserved an alliance even if no heir was born. A queen's household trained dozens of noble daughters who later married into other families. A charitable foundation supported townspeople for centuries. Though the medieval mind judged queens by their fertility, their impact was never so simple. They endured, adapted, and left marks even in the shadow of perceived failure. You may ask, why dwell on these quiet, half-forgotten women? Because their stories reveal the human side of monarchy. The grandeur of kingship depended on the fragile bodies of women expected to produce heirs. Their grief, resilience, and strategies for survival shaped kingdoms just as much as battles or treaties. If Eleanor of Castile shows you the price of fulfilling the role, the childless queens remind you of the cost of failing it, and of the quiet legacies created when survival meant finding new purposes. And perhaps this is the question to carry forward: when history values only heirs and dynasties, how much is lost by forgetting those whose significance lay in subtler forms of endurance? What would it mean to see these queens not as failures, but as survivors, shaping history in quieter ways that echo even now? If you picture the royal court of medieval France, you might imagine it as a world of glittering ceremonies, with gilded halls in Paris, solemn processions to Notre Dame, and long banquets lit by torchlight. Yet beneath this grandeur lay the same quiet, relentless expectation that defined queenship across Europe: the duty to produce heirs. In France, perhaps more than anywhere else, the question of succession was everything. For centuries, the stability of the Capetian dynasty rested on an unbroken line of male heirs. To break that chain would invite chaos, claimants, and war. And for the queens of France, this meant that every month of marriage carried a silent weight. Unlike Eleanor of Castile in England, many French queens were remembered less for the children they bore and more for the children they did not. Their stories often ended not in triumph but in obscurity, exile, or quiet retreat into convents. This is why historians sometimes call them the forgotten queens. They held the title, wore the crown, stood at coronations, yet their absence of heirs condemned them to the margins of memory. One of the earliest cases comes from the reign of Louis VII, the pious king whose marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine collapsed in part due to the lack of a son. Eleanor, as you recall, gave him only daughters. After 15 years of marriage, their union was annulled under the pretense of consanguinity. But everyone at the time understood the real motive: the king needed a son. Eleanor's departure was not just a personal separation but a national crisis solved through dismissal. For France, the queen's body had failed in its duty. Louis remarried twice. His second wife, Constance of Castile, bore him 2 daughters but died young. His third wife, Adela of Champagne, finally gave him a son, Philip II Augustus, who became one of France's most powerful kings. You can imagine what this meant. Adela was celebrated as virtuous, pious, even saintly, while Eleanor was quietly cast as a woman whose womb had betrayed France. Yet in reality, Eleanor would later prove her fertility by producing many children with Henry II of England. It was not her body that was barren, but the royal marriage itself. This pattern of dismissal, however, continued into later generations. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, France faced repeated crises of succession. Queens such as Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Jean of Burgundy, wives of the sons of Philip IV, were scrutinized mercilessly. Some bore children who died young, others were embroiled in scandal, and still others left no heirs at all. When Philip IV's sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, each died without surviving male heirs, the dynasty itself teetered on collapse. The absence of sons was not just a private sorrow, it plunged France into a constitutional crisis that ended the Capetian male line and opened the path to the Hundred Years' War. In this context, queens who failed to produce heirs became scapegoats. Chroniclers hinted at divine judgment, gossip spread about curses, and political rivals seized the opportunity to undermine them. Margaret of Burgundy, accused of adultery during the Tour de Nesle scandal, was imprisoned and died in captivity. Though her fall was tied to scandal, the absence of a male heir made it easier for the court to discard her. Without children to protect her position, she had no shield against disgrace. But even those who lived without scandal faced erasure. Take Jean of Burgundy, wife of Philip V. Though she eventually bore daughters, her inability to produce a surviving son left her vulnerable. Chroniclers described her as stern, pious, and intelligent, yet these qualities could not outweigh the absence of an heir. When Philip died, Jean receded into quiet widowhood, remembered faintly as the lame queen because of her physical disability, rather than as a central figure of politics. For these women the court itself became a place of both splendor and suffocation. Imagine walking through the halls of the Louvre Palace, hearing every conversation turn toward succession. Ambassadors speculated on your fertility. Bishops preached sermons about the blessings of sons. Courtiers whispered about your health, your diet, even your bedroom. Your body was never your own, it was a matter of state. And when your body failed to produce what was demanded, your very identity as queen was stripped away. Exile was a common solution. Some queens were sent back to their natal families, dismissed quietly as though their years of service had been a mistake. Others remained in France but were confined to convents, where their lives passed in piety and obscurity. For a medieval queen, the convent was both refuge and prison. It freed her from scrutiny but also erased her from politics. Her role as intercessor, mediator, and symbol of alliance vanished the moment her fertility was judged insufficient. What is striking is how little their own voices remain. We have charters, treaties, and chronicles written by men, but rarely do we hear the personal words of these queens. Were they bitter? Resigned? Did they envy queens who bore sons? Or did some find relief in retreat, no longer burdened by the pressures of succession? These questions remain unanswered, for their letters and diaries, if they ever existed, were not preserved. And yet, their silence speaks loudly. For the French monarchy, succession was sacred, and queens were measured not by their personalities, piety, or wisdom but by the heirs they bore. When they succeeded, they were praised as virtuous mothers of the realm. When they failed, they became shadows, erased from memory, remembered only in genealogical charts or the margins of chronicles. But this raises a deeper question: if so many French queens disappeared into silence, what does that tell you about the fragility of monarchy itself? How much power, how much stability, rested not on armies or laws, but on the uncertain hope of a child's cry in the nursery. And what became of France when that cry never came? If Section 1 showed you how fragile succession was in medieval France, Section 2 brings you closer to the personal cost carried by the queens themselves. For every triumphant queen who bore sons and secured her place in the line of history, there were others, unlucky, barren, or scandalized, who were set aside, imprisoned, or quietly erased. Their lives demonstrate not only the pressures of queenship but also the ways in which political necessity and personal tragedy intertwined. One of the clearest examples lies in the story of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their annulment was justified on the grounds of consanguinity, but everyone knew the true reason: Eleanor had failed to provide a male heir. When she left Louis in 1152, she carried with her not shame but an enormous inheritance, the Duchy of Aquitaine. In marrying Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England, she turned what was supposed to be her failure into one of the most consequential shifts in European politics. Yet the French court never forgot that she had left without a son. Chroniclers painted her as willful and dangerous, emphasizing her independence rather than her fertility, as though her inability to produce a French heir had somehow confirmed her unsuitability as queen. In the following centuries, many French queens were not so fortunate. Margaret of Burgundy, the wife of Louis X, found herself embroiled in one of the most infamous scandals of medieval France, the Tour de Nesle affair. Accused of adultery alongside two other royal women, Margaret was imprisoned in the Château Gallard. Whether she was guilty or not remains uncertain, but the political outcome was clear: her inability to produce a secure heir made her expendable. When Louis X died in 1316, Margaret was already dead, probably by suffocation or neglect in prison. Her story demonstrates how a queen without sons had no protection when scandal struck. Blanche of Burgundy, wife of Charles IV, also faced imprisonment during the same scandal. Though she survived, she was effectively discarded, living out her days in obscurity. Without children to tie her to the dynasty, her presence at court was an embarrassment rather than an asset. For these women, accusations of infidelity may have been exaggerated or manipulated, but their lack of heirs made it easier for political factions to eliminate them. Annulments, too, were a tool used against queens whose wombs failed to serve dynastic needs. Kings petitioned the papacy for dissolutions, often citing kinship or irregularities in the marriage contract. Behind these legal justifications lay the same silent truth: no heirs had been produced. The papacy, eager to maintain influence over kings, frequently granted such annulments. This gave rulers freedom to remarry in hopes of securing sons. The queens, however, were left with little more than pensions or dowries, their political roles erased. You can imagine the personal humiliation of such events. To stand crowned at Notre Dame, to be anointed with holy oil, to be honored as the most Christian queen, and then, only a few years later, to be declared unsuitable, cast aside, and sent back to one's family. A queen annulled was not only a wife rejected but a symbol of failed monarchy. Chroniclers rarely spared them compassion, for to admit sympathy would be to question the divine order that crowned kings and blessed heirs. Even queens who escaped scandal or annulment often endured quiet exile. Some were sent to convents, where they lived under vows of chastity and obedience. Though materially comfortable, their lives became shadows of their former glory. They embroidered, prayed, read psalters, and heard Mass daily, but the political vibrancy of court life was gone. These convents became the silent receptacles of royal failure, filled with women whose only crime was the absence of no protection when scandal struck. Blanche of Burgundy, wife of Charles IV, also faced imprisonment during the same scandal. Though she survived, she was effectively discarded, living out her days in obscurity. Without children to tie her to the dynasty, her presence at court was an embarrassment rather than an asset. For these women, accusations of infidelity may have been exaggerated or manipulated, but their lack of heirs made it easier for political factions to eliminate them. Annulments, too, were a tool used against queens whose wombs failed to serve dynastic needs. Kings petitioned the papacy for dissolutions, often citing kinship or irregularities in the marriage contract. Behind these legal justifications lay the same silent truth: no heirs had been produced. The papacy, eager to maintain influence over kings, frequently granted such annulments. This gave rulers freedom to remarry in hopes of securing sons. The queens, however, were left with little more than pensions or dowries, their political roles erased. You can imagine the personal humiliation of such events. To stand crowned at Notre Dame, to be anointed with holy oil, to be honored as the most Christian queen, and then, only a few years later, to be declared unsuitable, cast aside, and sent back to one's family. A queen annulled was not only a wife rejected but a symbol of failed monarchy. Chroniclers rarely spared them compassion, for to admit sympathy would be to question the divine order that crowned kings and blessed heirs. Even queens who escaped scandal or annulment often endured quiet exile. Some were sent to convents, where they lived under vows of chastity and obedience. Though materially comfortable, their lives became shadows of their former glory. They embroidered, prayed, read psalters, and heard Mass daily, but the political vibrancy of court life was gone. These convents became the silent receptacles of royal failure, filled with women whose only crime was the absence of children. The dynastic consequences of these forgotten queens cannot be overstated. The early 14th century saw three successive French kings, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, die without surviving male heirs. Their queens had borne children, but none that lived to adulthood. The result was nothing less than a constitutional crisis. Could the crown pass through the female line? Could a daughter inherit, or did the throne require a son? The French lords ultimately invoked what later became known as the Salic Law, barring women from the succession. This decision, born of desperation, had enormous consequences. It disqualified the claims of Edward III of England, who was descended from a French princess, and thereby set the stage for the 100 Years' War. Thus, the absence of heirs from these queens did not merely shape their personal fates. It reshaped the entire political landscape of Europe. Wars were fought, dynasties collapsed, and new laws were written, all because the nurseries of French queens stood empty. What remains haunting, though, is how little of their own voices survive. We know of their scandals, their imprisonments, their annulments, but not their feelings. Did Blanche of Burgundy pray for release? Did Margaret of Burgundy curse her fate in her prison cell? Did Jean of Burgundy, mocked for her limp, write letters lamenting her daughter's inability to inherit? Their lives exist only through the judgment of others, never through their own words. And this leaves you with an unsettling thought: when queens were dismissed, exiled, or disgraced, the kingdom moved on, but they remained alive. They lived for decades sometimes, forgotten in convents or distant estates. What did they think, year after year, as the courts celebrated new heirs, new coronations, new queens? What did it feel like to be alive but erased? As we move toward the quiet conclusion of these stories, we should pause to notice that queens without heirs were not always entirely powerless. Though sidelined from dynastic politics, many carved out new roles in the religious and cultural life of the kingdom. In their exile, whether in convents or country estates, they became patrons of abbeys, protectors of the poor, and models of piety. This subtle shift in role allowed them to transform personal failure into a different kind of legacy. Take, for example, Blanche of Navarre, the widow of Philip VI. Though she outlived her husband by decades, she never remarried. Instead, she devoted herself to religious works, living quietly while France descended into the early years of the Hundred Years' War. Her patronage helped sustain monasteries, and her reputation for piety gave her a dignity that politics had denied her. While she never bore the son that would continue her husband's line, she preserved something equally valuable, the memory of royal sanctity in turbulent times. Another example is Jean of Bourbon, wife of Charles V. Though her fertility was limited, many of her children died in infancy. She is remembered for her cultural patronage. The manuscripts copied and illuminated under her care influenced the artistic life of France for generations. Here, the absence of heirs did not erase her influence, rather, it redirected it. Instead of shaping succession, she shaped memory, devotion, and art. This pattern of queens turning toward piety and patronage reflects a broader truth about medieval monarchy. Even when excluded from political importance, these women carried symbolic weight. Their prayers were believed to intercede for the kingdom. Their gifts to monasteries secured not only their own souls but also those of their husbands and dynasties. In a society where salvation was seen as collective as well as individual, a queen's devotions mattered. Yet it is striking how often history treated their piety as consolation rather than achievement. Chroniclers wrote of them as resigned, saintly figures, quietly fading into the background. Their spirituality was described not as a deliberate choice but as a consequence of having nothing else to do. In this way, their agency was diminished, their lives reduced to footnotes. Still, if we look closer, their absence becomes a kind of presence. The very fact that chroniclers kept mentioning the lack of heirs shows how deeply it haunted the monarchy. Every empty cradle became a political wound. Every failed pregnancy carried the shadow of civil war. And every queen who lived on in exile, widowhood, or quiet prayer reminded the court of what had been lost. You might even say that these forgotten queens shaped French history through their silence. Their lack of heirs forced the monarchy to clarify succession laws, which in turn excluded women from ruling. That exclusion hardened over centuries, becoming a cornerstone of French political identity. Without their absence, there might have been no Salic law. Without the Salic law, there might have been no 100 Years' War. And without the 100 Years' War, the map of Europe might look very different today. Think of it this way. The most enduring legacy of some queens was not what they did, but what they could not do. In failing to produce sons, they reshaped dynastic law. In being cast aside, they opened the door to new alliances. In withdrawing into convents, they modeled a different kind of queenship, one less about power and more about endurance. And perhaps endurance is the final word here. These queens endured humiliation, disappointment, and neglect. They endured the whispers of courtiers and the judgments of priests. They endured being written out of chronicles except as warnings. But they also endured as individuals, praying, commissioning art, supporting abbeys, and simply continuing to live, year after year, when the world had already declared them irrelevant. As you drift into sleep, let your mind wander to a quiet cloister in 14th century France. Imagine a queen at prayer, her hands folded over a psalter illuminated with gold and lapis blue. Outside her window, the kingdom moves on without her, new kings, new wars, new coronations. But in her cell, she breathes, she whispers, she exists. Forgotten by history, but not erased. In the silence of that cloister, in the emptiness of that cradle, in the shadow of those annulments and exiles, we hear the echo of a truth that lingers still. Sometimes the absence of heirs speaks louder than the presence of kings. If you close your eyes, you can imagine Constantinople in its splendor. The marble streets gleam under the soft light of oil lamps, the sea walls stretch in mighty arcs around the city, and the vast dome of Hagia Sophia rises over it all. Within the great palace complex, the emperor sits not only as ruler but also as the center of an intricate web of expectation. For in Byzantium, the fate of an empire often rested not on armies or theology, but on something much quieter, whether the emperor and his empress could produce an heir. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire held together a fragile balance of traditions, Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian devotion. In this environment, the role of the imperial couple was not only symbolic but practical. They were expected to embody divine favor. A child born to them was not merely a continuation of bloodline, it was a reassurance that God's blessing still rested upon the empire. To be childless, then, was to invite questions of divine disapproval, to suggest that heaven itself had turned its face away from Constantinople. Consider Emperor Justin II, who ruled in the late 6th century. Though he inherited the throne from his uncle Justinian the Great, his own marriage produced no children. His wife, Empress Sophia, was a formidable woman, wealthy, influential, and politically astute, but without a son, her position was precarious. Rumors swirled that she sought to maneuver her own relatives into power, while courtiers whispered that God had cursed their union. The lack of heirs did not simply remain a private grief, it became a political crisis that shaped who would sit on the throne next. Sophia's experience was not unique. Again and again across Byzantine history, the palace resounded with anxieties over succession. Unlike in Western Europe, where strict dynastic rules eventually hardened under traditions like the Salic law, Byzantine succession was more flexible, sometimes too flexible. Emperors could designate nephews, sons-in-law, adopted heirs, or even ambitious generals. Yet each of these choices raised suspicions, bred rivalries, and gave rise to rebellions. A natural-born son offered the only clear path forward. Without one, the empire trembled. The palace itself reflected this tension. Within its sprawling halls, women of the imperial household lived under constant scrutiny. Empresses and concubines alike were judged by their ability to conceive. Astrologers were summoned to chart the stars, midwives employed every herbal remedy, and priests offered prayers in solemn processions. Childbirth was a public concern, and its failures were recorded in the chronicles with the same weight as military defeats. What made Byzantium unique, however, was the way theology intertwined with fertility. The empire's rulers were considered God's chosen representatives on earth. A barren marriage was not merely unfortunate, it risked being seen as heresy made visible in flesh. Some whispered that the empress's piety was insufficient. Others suggested that the emperor himself had sinned gravely. In either case, infertility became a public mystery to solve, a riddle that theologians and courtiers alike tried to interpret. The story of Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, also illuminates this theme. Though she and Justinian were deeply bound as partners, they produced no children. Instead, Justinian adopted his nephew Justin II as heir. In later years, critics claimed this decision weakened the empire, for Justin II proved an unstable ruler. Yet, in truth, the absence of a natural-born heir meant Justinian had no better choice. Here we see how private family matters could ripple outward, altering the fortunes of an entire empire. But what did it feel like, on a human level, to live through such expectation? Imagine Empress Sophia walking the mosaic-lined corridors of the great palace. Every servant's bow carried a silent question. Every feast included the whisper of courtiers measuring her age, her health, her likelihood of bearing a son. Behind her ceremonial robes and jeweled crowns, she carried a burden heavier than empire, the quiet, unyielding weight of an empty nursery. And it was not only women who bore this strain. Emperors themselves faced immense pressure. A ruler without sons invited conspiracies. Generals waiting in the wings, senators with ambition, and even distant cousins could see childlessness as opportunity. The emperor's body, no less than the empress's, was subject to speculation. Was he impotent? Was he cursed? Had he secretly fathered children elsewhere? Such rumors traveled quickly in a city that thrived on gossip. This intertwining of personal life and public destiny gave Byzantium a peculiar fragility. The great walls might repel barbarian invasions, the navy might control the seas, but within the palace, the absence of a baby could undo it all. A cradle left empty in the women's quarters might eventually lead to a coup in the hippodrome, where factions shouted for rival claimants to take the purple robes of power. And so, in Byzantium, the sound of silence was political. The hush of a palace without heirs was the prelude to upheaval. Behind the glittering ceremonies, behind the chants in Hagia Sophia, behind the golden mosaics that proclaimed divine order, there lurked a quiet dread. What happens when the emperor's line fails? That question will guide us deeper into this story, as we explore the lives of other imperial couples who faced this crisis, not once, but across centuries. From the Komnenoi who struggled to secure their dynasty, to the Palaeologi who watched the empire's last days unfold, the absence of children cast a shadow over Byzantium's most fateful moments. But for now, let us leave Sophia walking through the silent palace halls, her footsteps echoing under the vaulted ceilings, her gaze fixed on an uncertain future. The throne stands secure, but only for now. The empire waits, the court whispers, and the question lingers: what does it mean when an emperor's palace remains childless? When we left the story, Empress Sophia walked the halls of Constantinople's palace, shadowed by the unspoken weight of an empty cradle. Now, let us draw closer to the heart of what unfolded in Byzantium when heirs failed to appear, not just the quiet sorrow of a childless household, but the political earthquakes that followed. In a world where succession rules were fluid, the absence of sons created dangerous uncertainty. Unlike Western kingdoms, where primogeniture eventually hardened into law, Byzantium maintained a curious blend of tradition and improvisation. A nephew could be chosen, a co-emperor could be elevated, or an ambitious general could be proclaimed by the army. This flexibility gave Byzantium resilience in times of crisis, but it also bred instability. Without the stabilizing presence of a legitimate heir, the throne became a prize that many felt entitled to claim. One vivid example comes from the 9th century, during the reign of Empress Irene of Athens. She had only one son, Constantine VI, and their relationship became bitter. Constantine's early death left her ruling alone, an extraordinary situation in itself. Though Irene is remembered as the only woman to rule the empire in her own right, her inability to produce further heirs meant that her reign stood on a fragile foundation. Rivals used this lack against her, portraying her as an unnatural ruler. In time, she was overthrown, her name blackened by accusations of hubris. Behind the politics lay the same quiet truth: the imperial household had failed to secure its future through children. Later, in the 12th century, the Komnenian dynasty illustrates how deeply childlessness could fracture power. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos produced a large family, but his successors were not so fortunate. His grandson, Manuel I, married twice, yet his only legitimate son, Alexios II, died young, with no adult heir to stabilize the throne. The empire slid into crisis. Ambitious nobles seized the chance to position themselves as protectors or regents, and soon, coups and assassinations multiplied. The problem was not merely that Alexios II was gone, it was that the very idea of stable succession had been undermined. Even in the final centuries of Byzantium, the problem persisted. The Palaeologan dynasty, which presided over the empire's slow decline, faced repeated anxieties about heirs. John VIII Palaiologos, who ruled during the empire's desperate negotiations with the West, left no children at all. His brother Constantine XI inherited the throne but ruled without heirs. When he died in 1453 defending the walls of Constantinople against the Ottomans, the empire itself died with him. The long history of childless rulers, of uncertain dynasties, ended not in quiet exile but in fire and conquest. But to understand the lived reality of these dynastic fractures, we must return to the palace. Imagine the corridors lined with courtiers, each calculating their chances should the throne pass into uncertainty. Every senator, general, and noble family could begin to dream of imperial purple when no son was waiting in the wings. A barren imperial marriage was not just a private disappointment, it was an invitation to ambition. At times, this ambition took bloody form. The Byzantine court was infamous for its intrigues, blinding, poisonings, forced tonsure into monasteries. Without heirs to hold the line of succession, emperors were forced to adopt strategies of survival. Some elevated co-emperors, others married nieces into powerful families, and some resorted to adoption. Yet each maneuver only postponed the problem. Without a son, the dynasty always stood on sand. This atmosphere also placed immense strain on imperial women. While queens in the West could sometimes be quietly retired to convents, Byzantine empresses were often at the very center of succession politics. They were pressured to remarry quickly if widowed, to secure alliances through their daughters, or to adopt nephews as heirs. Their bodies were not only vessels of potential life but also pawns in the empire's chessboard. When pregnancies failed, suspicion often turned toward them. Was the empress too worldly? Too impious? Too ambitious? Each miscarriage became a political commentary, each barren year a whisper of divine displeasure. We can picture the emperor and empress seated side by side in the ceremonial throne room, their figures framed by golden mosaics. Before them, ambassadors bow, offering tribute. The empire seems eternal, its symbols unchanging. Yet behind the glitter lies fragility. For every envoy who bows, another courtier counts the years without an heir. For every hymn sung in Hagia Sophia, another faction sharpens its daggers in anticipation of a power struggle. The strain of this uncertainty seeps into the chronicles. Byzantine historians, often monks or court officials, record dynastic crises with weary familiarity. Again and again, they lament the lack of heirs, interpreting it as divine punishment for pride or heresy. The pattern becomes almost liturgical: a ruler without sons, a scramble for succession, a civil war, and finally, a fragile new order, until the cycle begins again. And so Byzantium endured not only sieges from without but also silences from within. The palace nursery, when left empty, could be as dangerous as a breach in the city walls. The absence of a baby in swaddling clothes could unleash forces that toppled emperors and reshaped dynasties. It is tempting to see these dynastic struggles as inevitable, but one must wonder, what if the heirs had lived? What if sons had been born to Justin II, or to Manuel I, or to John VIII? Would the empire have found stability, or would the ambitions of generals and nobles have erupted anyway? Perhaps Byzantium was fated to fracture, heirs or not. But as you listen now, drifting into the slow rhythms of history, remember how much of the empire's fate hinged on such intimate matters. The empire's walls could stand for centuries, but the absence of a single child could bring those walls trembling down. As the centuries drew Byzantium closer to its end, the absence of heirs became more than a private sorrow, it became a metaphor for the empire itself. A realm that had once stretched from the Adriatic to the Levant, from the Danube to the deserts of Syria, slowly dwindled until only Constantinople and a scattering of territories remained. The empty cradles of the imperial palace mirrored the fading power of a state that could no longer renew itself. By the 15th century, the Palaeologan dynasty stood as the last guardians of the empire. Yet here, too, the pattern repeated. Emperor John VIII Palaeologos ruled for decades but produced no children. His marriage was troubled, his empress left him and returned to her homeland, frustrated by the lack of affection and the endless strain of politics. With no heirs, John spent much of his reign negotiating with the West, seeking alliances, trade, and above all, military aid against the encroaching Ottomans. But when he died in 1448, he left not a son to inherit, but only a fragile line of brothers to divide the responsibility. His successor, Constantine XI, carried the empire's fate to its final hour. A brave man by most accounts, Constantine ruled without wife or children. He had once sought to marry, to secure heirs, but circumstances and politics frustrated his plans. By the time he ascended the throne, the empire was too weak, too beleaguered, to sustain the luxury of dynastic marriages. When he stood on the walls of Constantinople in May 1453, staring out at the vast Ottoman army, he knew that no son would continue his name. In a sense, the dynasty's silence had already foretold the empire's end, and it is poignant to imagine that final scene. While cannons thundered and prayers filled Hagia Sophia, the imperial palace stood quiet. No children played in its courtyards, no heirs waited nervously for news. The emperor himself was the last, a solitary figure carrying not only the burden of command but the weight of finality. When he fell in battle and the city was overrun, there was no one left to claim the purple. The empire and the dynasty vanished together, their lines extinguished in one final silence. But Byzantium's story of heirless emperors is not only about endings. Across its long history, we can see how the absence of children shaped new paths. Adoption, co-emperorship, and dynastic marriages with foreign princesses all arose from necessity. These innovations gave Byzantium flexibility, sometimes enough to survive, though never enough to erase the underlying anxiety. Indeed, one could argue that Byzantium's survival across 1,000 years owed something to its willingness to improvise succession when heirs were lacking. Where other dynasties collapsed outright, Byzantium adapted. And yet, the shadow of childlessness haunted its chronicles. Chroniclers did not simply record facts, they interpreted them. A barren empress, a dying son, a childless emperor, these were signs to be explained, warnings of divine displeasure. When disasters struck, such as plagues or invasions, the absence of heirs seemed to confirm that heaven had withdrawn its blessing. In this way, empty cradles became more than political problems, they became symbols of cosmic order unraveling. What strikes us now, centuries later, is how deeply personal lives shaped public destinies. The most intimate details, the rhythms of a marriage bed, the fragility of childbirth, the silence of a nursery, could alter the fate of continents. Emperors might command armies and rebuild cathedrals, but in the end, their legacies often hinged on whether or not a child's cry echoed through the palace halls. As you listen, let your mind return once more to those marble corridors, cool underfoot, echoing with footsteps but not with laughter. Picture an empress kneeling before an icon, her lips moving in prayer for a son. Imagine an emperor staring out over the Bosporus at twilight, wondering who would rule after him. These moments, invisible to battles and treaties, shaped the empire as surely as swords and ships. And perhaps this is the most enduring lesson of Byzantium's heirless emperors: history is not only written in wars and councils but in the quiet spaces where nothing happens. The cradle left empty, the succession unresolved, the silence unbroken, these, too, changed the world. When the final emperor fell, there was no child waiting in the palace to take his place. And so the empire ended, not only in conquest but also in the hush of an heirless throne. England in the 16th century was a kingdom obsessed with lineage. Every coronation, every treaty, every prayer whispered in the chapels of Westminster seemed to circle back to one pressing concern: who would inherit the throne? For the Tudor dynasty, newly established after the Wars of the Roses, this question carried a special urgency. The dynasty was young, its roots not yet deep. Without a steady supply of heirs, England risked sliding back into civil war. And so the private fertility of queens became a matter of national destiny. Nowhere is this more visible than in the story of Henry VIII, the king whose marriages became almost synonymous with dynastic crisis. Yet to understand the weight placed upon his wives, we must first step into the broader atmosphere of Tudor England. Unlike Byzantium, where succession rules were flexible, England had a relatively clear framework: a king's legitimate son was expected to succeed. Daughters could inherit, but such prospects stirred anxiety. The memory of civil wars fought between rival claimants still haunted the realm, and many feared that a woman on the throne would invite foreign domination or domestic rebellion. This fear meant that Henry's queens lived under constant pressure. Their bodies were national property in all but name, their fertility scrutinized by courtiers, ambassadors, and the king himself. A queen who failed to produce a son was not merely unlucky, she was seen as threatening the entire stability of England. The story begins with Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Married first to Henry's elder brother, Arthur, she became queen after Arthur's early death and her subsequent union with Henry. Catherine was deeply pious, intelligent, and politically capable. But her marriage was defined not by her strengths but by her pregnancies, 6 in total, most ending in stillbirths or infant deaths. Only one child survived, Mary, born in 1516. For Catherine, the repeated loss of children was both personal. Pattern that echoes across Europe. Queens were celebrated or condemned not for their character or counsel but for the state of their wombs. Catherine's piety, Anne's wit, Jane's gentleness, none of these defined them as much as whether they bore sons. The survival of dynasties hinged on something so fragile, so unpredictable, as pregnancy and childbirth. And yet, as you drift through these stories, it is worth noticing the human dimension beneath the politics. Imagine Catherine of Aragon kneeling in prayer at dawn, her rosary slipping through weary fingers as she asked God for a son. Picture Anne Boleyn pacing her chambers, listening to the gossip of ladies-in-waiting, every movement of her body scrutinized for signs of pregnancy. Think of Jane Seymour, pale and exhausted, cradling her newborn son with trembling arms, aware perhaps that she would not live to raise him. These were women caught in the collision between personal longing and public duty, their lives consumed by the demand for heirs. The irony is that the daughters who did survive, Mary and Elizabeth, would both rule England, shaping its destiny more profoundly than many kings before them. Yet in their own lifetimes, their births were disappointments, reminders of failure. The very queens who secured England's stability were once viewed as evidence of divine displeasure. At this point in the story, one cannot help but wonder, how might history have unfolded if Catherine's sons had lived? Would England have remained Catholic? Would Anne Boleyn's name be forgotten, her daughter Elizabeth never crowned? The loss of infants in Tudor nurseries was not simply private grief, it was the hinge upon which empires turned. For now, let us leave Catherine, Anne, and Jane where history left them, one discarded, one executed, one buried too soon. Around them swirled the machinery of politics and faith, but at the heart of it all lay the simplest, most fragile question: could a queen give birth to a son? The Tudor dynasty, for all its glitter and grandeur, was always fragile. Its roots were shallow, and its survival depended not on armies or wealth but on the survival of a few children. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, he left behind 3 legitimate heirs, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Yet even this small cluster of offspring was marked by uncertainty. One was a frail boy, the others women in a kingdom that doubted female rulers. The throne was full, yet empty at the same time, for no one could say with confidence how long these heirs might endure, or whether they would secure the dynasty with children of their own. Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited son, seemed to embody the solution to years of anxiety. His birth had been celebrated as a miracle, the child who would ensure the Tudor line. But Edward was sickly from the start. Thin, pale, prone to illness, he bore the crown with dignity but without strength. Courtiers and foreign ambassadors whispered about his health, some predicting his early death even as he was crowned. Edward reigned for just 6 years, and in that time his body became a canvas for the hopes and fears of England. His coughs were noted in council records, his fevers described in dispatches sent abroad. His frailty was not merely a private matter, it was the uncertainty of an entire nation. When he died in 1553 at the age of 15, leaving no heirs, the dynasty teetered once more on the brink of collapse. The crown passed to Mary, Catherine of Aragon's long-surviving daughter. For Mary, her reign was deeply tied to her body in a way few kings ever endured. She was in her late 30s when she became queen, and every subject, every ambassador, every priest immediately asked the same question: could she bear a child? Her marriage to Philip of Spain was arranged with that question in mind. If she gave birth to a son, the Tudor line would be secured and the alliance with Spain cemented. If she failed, England would face another uncertain future. In 1555, the kingdom erupted with joy, the Queen was pregnant. Bells rang, sermons praised God, and gifts were prepared for the expected heir. Mary's body swelled, her symptoms suggested pregnancy, and months of anticipation built to a fever pitch. Yet as the supposed due date passed, no child appeared. What Mary had endured was likely a phantom pregnancy, a cruel trick of her body that convinced even physicians of its truth. The disappointment was devastating, not only for Mary but for the entire realm. She tried again in 1557, with another supposed pregnancy that proved false. Her reign, once filled with promise, was consumed by this silent tragedy. When she died childless in 1558, the dream of a Catholic heir vanished with her. It was Elizabeth who inherited the throne next, and Boleyn's daughter, the child once dismissed as a disappointment. Elizabeth, unlike her sister, never even attempted to produce heirs. Whether by choice, circumstance, or calculation, she remained the virgin queen, ruling alone for 45 years. Her reign was one of the most celebrated in English history, bringing stability, exploration, and cultural brilliance. Yet beneath her glittering court lay the same question that had haunted her mother and grandmother: what would happen when she died? Elizabeth's decision not to marry became one of the great puzzles of her age. Courtiers pressed her, foreign princes courted her, and Parliament begged her to secure the succession. But she resisted, weaving her unmarried state into a political image of divine independence. She claimed to be wedded to her people, a bride of the nation itself. Yet even as her image grew, the absence of an heir cast a long shadow. Plots brewed around potential successors, rival claimants stirred unrest, and the question of who would follow her lingered like a whisper through every chamber of power. The irony is striking. For decades, Henry VIII had torn England apart in his desperate pursuit of a son. He broke with the Pope, dissolved monasteries, and reshaped the very fabric of faith in England, all to secure heirs. Yet his only legitimate son died young, his daughters reigned in turn, and neither left children. The Tudor line, for all Henry's labors, ended with Elizabeth in 1603. When she died, the throne passed not to a Tudor child but to a distant relative, James VI of Scotland, descended from Henry's sister Margaret. The dynasty that Henry had fought so hard to secure had ended with silence, its cradles empty, its line extinct. But within that silence, something remarkable had taken place. The daughters once viewed as disappointments had redefined what it meant to rule. Mary, for all her failures, had shown that a woman could govern in her own right. Elizabeth had gone further, transforming her unmarried state into a symbol of power and authority. The wombs of Tudor queens had failed by the measure of heirs, but in the measure of history, their reigns altered England forever. And so the story of Tudor infertility is not only a tale of tragedy, it is also a tale of irony and transformation. The kings who obsessed over sons left behind daughters who ruled with strength, wit, and endurance. The empty cradles of the 16th century did not weaken England as many feared. Instead, they cleared the path for one of its most remarkable eras. As you let this story drift in your thoughts, imagine the quiet of Hampton Court in winter, where once the walls echoed with the cries of newborns that never survived. Picture Mary walking solemnly through the palace gardens, her hand resting on a belly that would never deliver a child. See Elizabeth at her desk, her crown beside her, writing letters late into the night, her chamber silent save for the scratching of her quill. These moments of solitude, of absence, are as much a part of Tudor history as the pomp of coronations or the clamor of Parliament. The dynasty ended not with a triumphant lineage of sons but with an heirless queen, her body untouched by childbirth, her name immortalized in legend. For all their obsession with fertility, the Tudors found their legacy not in children, but in history itself. The Tudor story ended in 1603, not with the joyful cries of a royal nursery, but with silence. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, died childless at the age of 69. In her final days, courtiers crowded around her, desperate to know who would inherit the crown. The queen, frail and weary, no longer possessed the sharp wit that had kept her throne secure for decades. She left no son or daughter to claim her legacy, no blood heir to continue the line that Henry VIII had so violently reshaped England to preserve. When James VI of Scotland was declared her successor, it marked both an end and a beginning. The Tudor dynasty, the house that Henry had gambled everything to establish, was finished. In its place came the Stuart line, bringing together the crowns of England and Scotland. Yet even as England moved forward, the anxieties of Tudor queens and their empty cradles remained imprinted on the memory of the realm. It is easy to think of the Tudors as larger than life, Henry with his towering figure, Elizabeth with her radiant speeches, Mary with her fiery devotion. But beneath the public grandeur lay the private reality of bodies, marriages, and the relentless demand for heirs. For women, especially queens, infertility was never simply a personal matter. It was political, national, and, in some ways, existential. A barren womb was not seen as an individual misfortune, it was treated as a failure of destiny, a threat to the stability of the kingdom. Consider Catherine of Aragon, whose repeated pregnancies ended in stillbirths or the early deaths of infants. For her, each loss chipped away not only at her health but at her authority. The people pitied her at first, then doubted her, and finally watched as her marriage was dismantled in pursuit of another woman's womb. Her infertility, though hardly unusual for the time, was treated as a flaw so grave it altered the course of European religion. Think of Anne Boleyn, whose inability to provide Henry with a living son transformed her from the dazzling jewel of the court to a condemned woman. Her miscarriages became fuel for gossip, whispers that she had bewitched the king or brought a curse upon herself. In the end, it was not only politics but her empty cradle that made her vulnerable to destruction. Reflect on Mary I, who carried not one but two phantom pregnancies. Her body betrayed her twice, offering hope and then crushing it. Courtiers prepared nurseries, bishops wrote prayers, and the kingdom rejoiced, only for nothing to come. Mary's childlessness left her isolated, mocked by her enemies, and remembered as Bloody Mary, her efforts to restore Catholicism overshadowed by her failure to produce an heir. And then Elizabeth. The woman who defied expectation by never attempting to bear a child at all. Her decision, or perhaps her fate, freed her from the humiliations that had plagued her mother and sister. Yet even she was haunted by the question of succession, her unmarried state always a topic of speculation and anxiety. She turned that absence into an image of power, but it remained an absence nonetheless. In their different ways, each Tudor queen was shaped by infertility. The lack of heirs defined marriages, determined policies, and reshaped alliances. Yet the irony is striking: for all Henry VIII's desperate efforts, for all the heartache of his wives, the Tudor dynasty produced just 3 monarchs who ruled into adulthood, and none of them left children. The dynasty ended as it began, fragile, uncertain, and bound by the fate of a single womb. And still, the Tudors endure in our imagination. We remember Henry's appetite, Elizabeth's speeches, Anne's downfall, Mary's sorrows. We rarely pause to dwell on the quieter truth, that the story of this dynasty is not just one of politics and wars, but of pregnancies that failed, of births that never came, of expectations placed upon women who could not possibly control the whims of chance or biology. As you lie in the stillness of night, imagine those silent royal chambers. The nurseries prepared but never filled. The cradles carved from oak, waiting for infants who never arrived. The prayers whispered in candlelit chapels for the safe delivery of sons, prayers that ended in sighs of disappointment. The heavy gowns of queens concealing the swelling of hopeful bellies, only for those hopes to dissolve into grief. These are not the dramatic scenes that fill the pages of history books. They are the quiet tragedies, the boring but relentless realities of royal life. And yet they shaped empires. Without Catherine's failures, there may have been no Reformation. Without Anne's miscarriages, perhaps her daughter Elizabeth would never have ruled. Without Mary's phantom pregnancies, the course of religion in England might have shifted. Even infertility, as dull and private as it seemed, carried the weight of nations. When Elizabeth died and the Tudor name faded into memory, England entered a new chapter. But the anxieties of that age, the obsession with heirs, the burden placed upon women's bodies, the fragile link between fertility and power, did not disappear. They echo still, in every monarchy that worries over succession, in every society that places expectations on women's capacity to bear children. The Tudors may be gone, their line extinguished, but their struggles remind us that history is not always shaped by battles or treaties. Sometimes, it is shaped by the quiet absence of children never born, by the emptiness of royal cradles, by the silence where laughter might have been. And so the story closes, not with triumph, but with reflection. The Tudors sought to build eternity through bloodlines, but instead left their immortality in memory. Their heirs are not sons or daughters, but the stories we continue to tell.